Hi and welcome to the Matter Over Mind podcast. My name is Stephen Mather. I'm a business psychologist, and as ever I'm with my podcast partner in crime, he who plays with plasma. It's experimental physicist Thomas. Hello Thomas.
Yes, how you doing?
I'm very well, how are you?
Yeah, good. I've just got back from a long trip, which has been nice.
Okay, so we've both been on work trips, and we'll compare them, shall we? Where did you go and what did you do then?
I went to California to look at, specifically in Livermore in California, to talk at a conference on the National Ignition Facility user meeting, and also as part of it, I got a tour of the NIF, which is very cool.
Cool. So, our listeners, so we record these podcasts in pairs or dyads, as I like to keep saying. I'm just going to keep on with that. So if you are listening to the two together, then, and you're listening in order, then in between us recording the last one, which was all about fusion, and recording this one, you've been to California and seen the NIF and all the stuff that we talked about last time. You've already done it. You've done it now already. So like, it's like one of those bits in the films, in the movies, when you get that sort of harpy music, and you know, a week later. So tell us about the trip then. Tell us a bit more about what you did and what the conference was about, and what NIF was all about.
Yeah, so the conference itself was basically open to any users, which basically just means anybody who works on these facilities. So the research group I'm part of has done experiments on the NIF before, and we plan to do some in the future. So it's a good opportunity for me to go there and then present some of my work I've been doing, and then sort of generally get to know or sort of engage with the US sort of fusion crowd. So by fusion, I kind of more specifically mean high energy density physics, which fusion comes under that. Yeah. So I go to quite a few UK conferences, so I kind of know the people in the UK that do this kind of stuff. But this is sort of branching out a little bit. We've got some collaborators that we work quite well with and quite a lot with in Rochester. So some of those were there, and then also just generally people from the NIF. So it was quite interesting to see, I guess, updates on fusion and updates on techniques and stuff that they're using at the moment, sort of state of the art. So it's very cool. Yeah.
Very good. And you got to see the bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge, San Francisco.
Yes, yeah. So on my first day there, I got there, and then there's like a day in between the conference where I had not a lot to do. So I thought I'll do some sightseeing. So I went to San Francisco proper, which is about an hour away by car from where I was. Okay. Saw the Golden Gate Bridge, which is really nice to see, and then I also did the Alcatraz tour. It's now a shut down prison, so they just use it for tourist stuff. So that was quite fun. Did the little went to the Rock, as they call it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, I went to Hull.
Fun. Great.
Yeah, sort of Yorkshire, in England. Not quite the same glamour, Thomas.
No, maybe not.
But I did. I took a picture of me in front of the Humber Bridge, which, you know, is in itself, of its time, it was an impressive structure. But it doesn't quite look as cool as the Golden Gate Bridge, but still, you know. We've put these pictures on the Facebook page, so if you're a listener, check out those pictures. There's a selfie. I've got a selfie, but Thomas didn't do a selfie because he's not vain like me. He just wanted to take a picture of the bridge, and that's cool. All right. Very good. All right. So that was last time. And if you're listening to the two together, then you'll have just heard all the stuff around fusion. And very interesting topic. But today we're on to our mind stuff. So this is a psychology episode. So Thomas, tell us what you're going to be asking about today.
Yeah, so today, kind of following along from last week, with sort of consciousness, sort of, I guess, zoom in and sort of look at the self with the main, I guess, characterization or personality traits.
Right.
So from my limited understanding, I think there's five, right? Five main ones. Or
Yeah, on the
plus,
what's called the ocean
yes, the
model.
ocean
Yeah, yeah,
is kind of
yeah.
the main one that I came across when I had a bit of a Google. And there's another one that came up, which I think is a test, and that seems to have a few more.
Okay.
I can't remember it started with M something.
Okay. Not sure about that one.
But yeah.
You were watching you sent me a video that you've been watching, which was I always like to reference the videos because that's kind of how we get into these topics. The crash course. So there's a guy on YouTube, and his channel is called Crash Course. I really recommend it. Actually, it's a really good channel. I use it too, for all sorts of just quick but pretty accurate factual information about all sorts of topics. So yeah, big shout out to him. Check that out. It's a good little podcast. But yeah, that's quite an interesting one. So well, first of all, ask you what questions do you want to ask me about, if any, first, I suppose, and then I've done a bit of thinking about this topic, but what are your sort of areas of interest?
So I guess it's interesting that you can boil down, based on large statistics of a bunch of people's answers to a set of questionnaires, how you can boil down to a handful of seemingly recurring character traits or characteristics, seemingly across cultures as well. And it's interesting that you can boil it down to a handful when you would think, like kind of what we were mentioning last time about complexity kind of gives rise to extra stuff. So it's interesting that when you look at these broad strokes, you can boil it down to such neat little bins. So I was going to ask, I guess, how do you test this stuff? So, I mean, some of these questionnaires, I guess, who decides the questionnaires, and then how can you quantify, or how can you distill from a couple hundred questions of true or false or whatever? How can you find this stuff out?
Okay, so I'll address that question, and then I think I want to sort of put it in reverse gear, put our podcast into reverse gear for a moment, and start to challenge some of the assumptions that are behind these tests. But first of all, how is it done, I suppose? So the good ones, the ones that are based upon proper scientific research, and I make that point very, very strongly because it's one of my kind of pet peeves about this whole industry. It's a massive industry. It's called Psychometrics. So it's using statistical analysis essentially to give people reports about their psychological tendencies, traits, types, and I'll get into all of that in a minute. But it's a massive industry, and there's some of these that really don't have very much scientific basis behind them, but are incredibly popular, and make absolutely millions of dollars every year selling these things to people, and they're also very influential. But so that's kind of an aside. But in terms of how the good ones are done, how the proper ones are done, like the big five, they tend to get called. So if you think about sort of characteristics, it's all based around the way we talk about characteristics. So you might say that somebody's, I don't know, quite outgoing. That might be a word that you would use to describe somebody's personality. You might say they're very outgoing. Or in another setting, you might say somebody is very sociable. So you might say this person's sociable. And then another time you might say this person's very friendly. So these are all very different words to describe people's characteristics. And, there's, in English, of course, there's, literally thousands of these. I'm guessing, I haven't counted them. But there are many, many, hundreds at least, different ways of describing people's characteristics. And these are used to, in everyday language. So what you're trying to do there is you're trying to say, right, okay, how many of these are so similar that they are basically the same? How many of these are similar but not exactly the same? So they belong to certain sort of groups or families, if you like. And how many are completely different, just opposites maybe of each other. So you're trying to work out what the correlations are. Essentially, it's a correlations exercise. It's an exercise in statistical analysis. And the way they originally done was, lots and lots and lots. Again, don't know the exact number, but we'll be talking hundreds, probably thousands of questionnaires where people were asked to group descriptions together and also do various sort of personality type questions about themselves and so on. And so it's then an activity of trying to find correlations between these different terms. So if a term means exactly the same thing, like I suppose if you were to say this person is joyful and this person is happy, then for all intents and purposes, you would probably say that they're the same thing. You could, if you were a linguist or I suppose an author, you might say, oh, well, there's subtle differences, but essentially they mean the same thing. So that would have a correlation of 1. So the R, so in maths, I'm sure you know this, but in mathematics, when you're measuring correlations, you're looking at the expression R. So in that case, R would equal 1. So this would be an exact correlation, which would basically mean that they mean the same thing. If you were trying to whittle down people's characteristics, then you say there's no point in having these two different phrases that mean the same thing. Let's just get rid of them and go with 1. And then you'd do that for everything. And then you'd say, right, which of these are similar, if not exactly the same? So you'd then start grouping them together. And you say, like, I don't know, things like sociability, friendliness, and so on, you might put into another bucket. And you might say, okay, we're going to categorize these as being generally around the extroversion sort of category. People are very friendly or very outgoing and so on and so on. So you're really trying to reduce the amount of ways you can describe people into as few as possible. Now, early on, there was a guy called Cattell who came up with 16. And that I think is probably a better one than the 5 that we end up with. He believed that you couldn't simplify it down to just 5. You needed 16. And so that's quite a good one, actually. There's 16 factors, and they go from high to low. So again, we're talking about a sort of dimension on which you are either high in this area or low in this area. So let's go with the extroversion versus introversion. You could be high extroversion, and that goes along a continuum. And you could be very low in that area, which I suppose we'd call introversion. So that's the way it kind of works. In terms of evidence for it, it's only done through correlation. So it's what is it measuring? It's measuring people's perception and description in the English language, and that's another potential problem with it, but it's measuring people's perception and descriptions of characteristics that the assumption in the theory behind all this is that we can explain or we can describe people's personalities using words. Obviously we have to accept that if we're going to use this type of method, and that's kind of how it's done. So there isn't a sort of external, totally objective method, because of course we are talking about language and ways that people describe things. So that's as good as it gets. It's a statistical analysis, reducing all these different characteristics into as few buckets as possible, recognizing that there are lots of nuance inside of those, and a lot of these systems will take account of those as well. So it's not like they just completely ignore all those nuances. They will have families and subfamilies and so on that are being measured, but in terms of the report that comes out, it reduces them to 5, so that it's easier to understand or to read it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I think so. Yeah. Okay. So the base assumption there is so supposing our description of happy or sad or whatever, suppose those are true, those are your ground truth, and then from that you're building others. Okay, that makes sense. I guess my question is how. So you said there's 16, or with the big 5.
Well, that's 5. Depending on which one you go with. Cattell's is 16. Mm-hmm. Costa and McRae is 5, which tend to get called the big 5. There's disagreement about what should be called the big 5. Most people think of Costa and McRae's Ocean as the big 5, which is openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Mm-hmm. Goldberg's big 5 replaces one of them. I think it's openness with intellect or intelligence. Okay. So there's differences there, but yeah. So carry on. Sorry, I interrupted you.
So how independent are these? These 5 or 16 or however many variables. How independent are they? I guess is my question.
Independent from each other.
Yeah. So suppose I've got high agreeableness. Will that affect my neuroticism? Say.
That's a great question, because that kind of goes to the heart of what they're trying to do with these big 5. So when you get to the situation where you really can't, there is no correlation, no meaningful correlation between them, mm-hmm. then you're really saying that these are separate things that cannot be merged with another one, and that's why you end up with a 5. So the answer to that would be no, they are, or I forget the actual way you phrase the question, but they cannot be mixed up with each other. They are separate traits.
Okay. So they're wholly independent variables.
They're independent. Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Now, you might say that there will be. That's interesting, because I don't actually know the data on this, but you might anticipate that there could be more of, let's say, high agreeableness and high extroversion in the population. You might say that it's, because of those traits are kind of a little bit more, likely to create a more balanced psyche, that you might see more of those things, but they are still not related to each other.
Okay, I think I've got a good picture in my head. So kind of how I'm seeing it is, suppose you've got like a number line, 0 to say 5, just for this argument, and then you've got really tight bell-shaped curves or normal distribution curves, or what's called the Gaussian, so very tight Gaussians, and the tails of, say, at position 3 and 4, the tails of either Gaussian on either side, they're just about touching, but they're basically not. And then with the more words, the more descriptive words, so the more in-betweens, obviously you have more and more Gaussians, till eventually all the Gaussians are crossing over, and then now there's dependencies on one another. They're now no longer independent. That's kind of how I'm picturing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess... So for those listeners who don't know what we're talking about, so imagine you've probably seen the bell curve example there. The norm is in the middle there with sort of variation either side. I think actually probably a better way of imagining it, actually, and the way that we did it in university was think of it more as sort of Venn diagrams with multiple overlaps. So it's too many. You wouldn't be able to do a kind of proper visual diagram of it, because it would just be too complicated. But think of it as overlapping characteristics. So that, and then you end up with certain families that are you could group together, and then you have an overriding one that then you can give that a name, and that in that activity itself is actually quite difficult. What are you going to call it? That's one of the tricky bits around it. But yeah, so think of it more of overlapping circles on a Venn diagram where categories sort of overlap with each other.
Okay.
Yeah. So any other sort of questions on that?
No, I mean that makes sense in terms of
Okay.
just classification assuming that I guess language is true, or
Yeah.
acknowledging there is some error in language, or some you know some variance in the descriptive words. But
yeah. So I mean, obviously, when you're thinking about ways that characteristics are described through language, then you're straight away into difficulty, because obviously you can imagine that people have different sort of general perceptions of words. So you're but again, if you ask enough people, then statistically you should come to a situation where you've got a reasonable agreement on what words like outgoing mean, for instance. So generally we're talking about fairly common ways of describing people, but it does illustrate part of the problem. Now, one of the criticisms that I've read in the literature is obviously because a lot of this work has been done in English, so the all of these questionnaires were first developed in English and these ideas were developed in English, then obviously that's quite a problem then when you come to try to do this in other languages. So you can obviously start to look at different words, and you have to then do the same thing you've done really in English as in these other languages as you would in English. There is some work that's being done, or that was being done when I was doing my degree, so that's like 10 years ago now, but there was like an international effort to try and look at all sorts of different languages and find international or cross-cultural characteristics or traits that you could use. So I don't know where that research has gone, actually. I've not caught up with that, but that'd be quite interesting to see, whether you could actually say that, in every culture these are the big five, for instance, So yeah, that's one of the criticisms, is that it's very sort of English language focused. Another one is that it doesn't really tell you much about why people are behaving that way. So it's kind of so one of my criticisms of the video that you sent me, which is the one that you kind of looked at originally, which I've given lots of praise to, the crash course, but in a way I think he makes a massive mistake right at the beginning of it. And then at the end, and this is another one of my kind of hobby horses, but he kind of says, I don't know if you remember this, but he kind of says it's really all about self. Who am I? And and then he goes on to talk about personality. And I think it's worth, for a few minutes, just trying to parse these different terms that we've started with. We started with consciousness last time, and I think it's important to think about, we said that consciousness is best thought about as this self-awareness or this subjective experience. So think of consciousness as that subjective experience.
Yeah.
So I think you can say that that's the thing on its own. I think it's possible for a being to have consciousness without having a sense of self.
Sure, yeah, okay.
I would argue, and I don't really have lots of evidence for this, but I would argue that many animals are like this. So an animal is conscious, it experiences the world, but I would question whether it has a sense of self.
Okay, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah. I suppose it's like when you see animals looking in the mirror and they kind of freak out and they don't know what's going on.
So some animals recognise themselves in the mirror. There's a really interesting sort of psychology test. I don't know if you've seen this, the dot experiment. Have you seen this?
No, I've not. No.
So one of the things that we've done to try and, first of all, see when humans have a sense of self is you get a baby in front of a mirror and they're looking at the mirror, and then you distract them for a minute and you just put a little dot on their forehead, like a little sticker or something on their forehead, and then you see what they do. And if they look at the mirror and they they put their hand to their head to get the sticker off or whatever.
Yeah.
This suggests that they recognise that it's them in the mirror.
Yeah, okay.
So I forget the age now. I didn't prepare this bit, but I think it's around 18 months when children start to develop the ability to recognise themselves in the mirror and that it's them.
Okay.
And not many animals can do it, but some can.
Oh, okay.
Dogs don't do it, as far as I remember. But dolphins do. So that's quite an interesting test because obviously they're underwater, so you have to be quite clever about how you do that one. But they've done like experiments with this. So dolphins recognise that. So that suggests that they do have a sense of self. So my point anyway is that you can be conscious without having a sense of self.
Sure.
So we need to separate these things out. We've got consciousness, we've got a sense of self. And then what the guy does in the video, he's sort of, so forget the consciousness bit for a moment. He sort of focuses on this idea about who am I? Who am I? How do I understand myself? And then straight away jumps to personality.
Yeah.
And I've done that myself in my research, and when I was doing my masters, I sort of did that, and I started to realise that I'm talking about different things here. So in my paper, I was talking about identity, sense of self, personality, and it occurred to me that actually this is kind of all jumbled up. So I think we have to be careful. So if you're talking about traits, personality traits, you're talking about behaviour.
Okay.
You're talking about what people do. So a trait is literally, this is a tendency to do something. This person has a tendency to behave. Let's say they tend to behave aggressively sometimes. They go mad. They lose their control. If you challenge them about something, that's a behavioural trait. You can sort of anticipate that, or that if you put them in front of a weepy movie that they're going to cry. This is a behavioural trait, but actually what you're talking about is behaviour. So the only way you can sort of see whether you're right about that is if the person does it or doesn't do it.
Sure.
But if you think about behaviour, you can describe anything as having behaviour. So a rock behaves in a certain way. If you throw it off the cliff, it falls down. You would say that rock behaves in that sense.
Sure.
So everything behaves that is an object in the world. So all objects have behaviour. Balls have behaviour because they roll. Blocks don't because they don't roll. And so each thing in the world has behaviour, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have a sense of self. So again, I think you have to parse these things. So that's my big beef with the video, but that's unsurprising because I guess we've all made that mistake in some respects. So when we're talking about behaviour, we're really talking about or when we're talking about personality, actually, we're really talking about behaviour. Unless we think about it in a different way. But I think most of the things like the Big Five, the Cattell's 16, there's the Neopi, which is another one. That might be the other one you're thinking about. These are all trait-based things that are about what sort of behaviour are they likely to do. So I think those things need to be parsed.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess what you're saying with the description of the dot test in the mirror.
Yeah.
You said that most animals don't have that, but you could observe a particular animal and you could describe its particular behavior. It could itself be aggressive or agreeable or whatever it may be, right? So I suppose that they are, as per that description, you don't need a sense of self to behave in a way, right?
Exactly, yeah. So you know that let's take a really fairly primitive, all life is fairly complex, but a fairly primitive creature like a worm, I suppose. A worm is pretty simple in the grand scheme of things. But that if it rains, then often worms come out of the ground. That is a behaviour. it doesn't mean that they have a sense of self where they're going, looks like it's raining. I better get out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that's important to sort of pass all of those.
No, I think that makes sense. I think, yeah. I didn't really pick up on that, to be honest, with the video, that he kind of collated the two as basically the same thing.
Yeah.
Kind of, which makes sense. I'm not a psychologist, right? So it went.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a fairly controversial idea. Some people would disagree with me on this one, and I think just going back to the personality traits. Now, the questionnaire things that you've mentioned, there are two different sorts of those. There are type tests and trait tests. So when it comes to personality descriptions, then there's two ways of looking at it. You can either look at it as types or traits. Now, I'm a traits man. I'm going to put my cards on the table. I'm into traits, not into types. I don't like the types thing. In fact, I actually get quite worried. I mean, it's not something I'm anxious about every day, but I do get concerned about the proliferation of these tests that you can do that tell you this and tell you that. I hear people say, "Oh, is a real red or is a real green," and I just wince every time I hear people say that, because it's a bit simplistic, and it also labels people, which I'm not sure is particularly useful. Let me just get into the types and the traits. So I suppose older than the traits is the type theory, and the type theory is that we, as personalities, we have a type. We are a type of person.
Okay.
Something like the Jungian, the tests that are based upon Jung. We talked about Jung in the very first psychology episode of this series, but he also looked at personalities, and he came up with various different personality types. And that was built upon by a few different people, but the most common one is the Myers-Briggs one,
Yes,
which
that
a
was the
lot
one.
of people have heard of. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Yes. I couldn't remember the name, but yeah, Myers-Briggs.
Myers-Briggs.
That's the first thing that comes up when you Google.
Yeah, Myers-Briggs. So Myers and Briggs, two women who developed this psychological test, who didn't actually have any psychological training, based it upon the Jungian theory around introversion, extroversion, and so on. I mean, that's sort of carried on through most of the tests, actually. But this particular one, MBTI, I don't know whether you've ever done one of these tests, but basically you're asked to look at various extremes, if you like, introvert, extrovert, and you have to put a tick in the box of which of those you would say you are. And you answer lots and lots of questions, and there's, are you this or are you that? Are you this or are you that? Are you this or are you that? So you basically tick which box you think you are. And at the end of it, you get a readout that gives you a sort of 4-letter description. And that's based upon these choices that you've made. But it bases, the theory behind it is that we are psychological types. So I'm a extrovert or I'm an introvert, and so you have these kind of labels that you stick on yourself. So that a type is a very fixed thing. You are this thing. I think that's a potential problem, and I see it in the workplace. Obviously, I'm a business psychologist, and this is where it's used the most. And I think and there's a lot of them like these. It basically gives people a label and says, "Oh, you're a red, or you're a extrovert, or you're a this, or you're a that. You're a systems person, or you're a feelings person." And I think that is quite. It's reductive, so people are much more complex than that. It's just too simplistic, but also it's very restrictive. It tends to put people in boxes, and if we're not careful, it puts us in boxes. So I don't like it. I don't like this type of thinking about personality. Much better is a trait-based approach, which says that, for instance, with the Big Five, which is a trait-based one, it says that you can talk about something like openness, and you can either be high in openness or relatively low in openness. So openness, open to new experiences, open to different sorts of people, new ideas. So generally quite open, but it's a continuum. So you might be a bit open or a bit more open than the next person.
Sure.
But you don't have to be either open or closed.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with these type-based ones, is you're either one or the other. Whereas I don't think that, because obviously there's lots of situational factors, there's lots of, we go through growth and all of that sort of stuff. And I think trait-based models are much, much better in that respect. It gives you this person tends to do more of this and more of that, but it doesn't mean they'll never want to go to a party if they're low on extroversion. It just means that, generally speaking, they'll choose to keep their own company or not go to a loud party. But doesn't mean to say they'll never do it. And so I think that's better. So that's one of my big beefs with the Myers-Briggs and other type-based ones. The other one is that it's not very robust in terms of research. So they would disagree with this. Obviously, the people who sell Myers-Briggs. So this is just my opinion. Don't sue me. But most psychologists don't really hold much store by the Myers-Briggs, or indeed any of the type-based ones. They tend to go for the more trait-based ones.
Okay. And could that be because it's easier to quantify the traits-based ones? Because you said that the early days it was this this type-based. So could it just be? I guess if that was the starting point, and then since the trait-based has been developed, is it has the trait-based been developed because of the shortcomings of the type-based, or is it more just the two different schools of thought and one happens to be more quantitatively robust?
I think since the more scientific approach to personalities, I mean, the question of personality is one that's been around a long time. You may have, on the video, remembered, or you may remember that he also talks about the Hippocratic humours, which is kind of fascinating. I mean, so this idea of characteristics, traits, have been around for absolute years. This goes back to Hippocrates, the Greek philosopher, or sort of the father of, well, we think about it as the father of modern medicine, the Hippocratic Oath and all of that. But their thinking at the time was there were 4 humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. So these were the idea was you had these liquids in your body, and the balance of these had to be right. And if they weren't, then you'd have a excess of one or the other, and that's what caused personality traits. That's why people would be. And even today, our language, we still use that. So some of these are fairly are words that we don't use so much, but like sanguine, we might use sanguine, which comes from that's the blood humour. We also talk about melancholic, people who are melancholic, and that's from the black bile. Phlegmatic is another one. So so it's quite interesting how we still think about those, and in a way that's the forerunner of all of this stuff. But going back to your question, I think with the advent of sort of more scientific approaches to personality, the trait fits better into the evidence, what we're actually seeing with the evidence, and based around other psychological theories as well. Yeah, there is another one of these ways of thinking about personality, which was Bandura. So some of our listeners might remember Bandura's experiments with children and Bobo the doll. Have you ever seen that experiment?
Maybe. Bobo. Maybe I'm thinking about The Simpsons with Monty Burns' little bear.
That may well come from that, but Bobo, basically what Bandura was interested in is the way that our social world moulds us, our personalities. So there's one thing about the trait-based and the type-based personality, which is more sort of internal. It's about us. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of acknowledgement around circumstances or situations or the socialization of people. But Bandura was interested in how our social world molds our personality, or at least influences it. One of the experiments is very famous. You can look it up on YouTube, which was he showed a child a big blow up doll, not that sort of blow up doll, but a doll that was like I don't know what you call them. It's like a weeble. It didn't have any legs, but so you could hit it and it would come back up again. So air-filled doll, and he showed the children videos, or let them see adults assaulting this doll with a hammer. So basically they were knocking 7 bells out of this doll with a hammer, just banging it and shouting at it, and being aggressive towards the doll, hitting it and all of that. And so they then, it might not have been a hammer, maybe I'm just making that up in my mind, maybe that's a false memory, because the next bit is they got the kids to do it. I'm not sure they gave the kids a hammer. Anyway, the next thing that happened, they gave the kid a chance to stay with the doll on his own, and of course he started beating it up just like the adults did. And this has been used and abused, really misused, to sort of demonstrate that children sort of copy adults, which is not a big surprise. I'm not sure that's like a huge shock, but what he was trying to show was that our environment and our social world has a big factor in how we behave. Our personality traits are to some degree molded by our parents, by our upbringing, and then ongoing in our sort of social world. But it sort of goes further than that, because if you think about, like, you're interacting with people, so this is all about social. It's a social theory. So when you interact with somebody else, that person also responds to your response.
Sure.
Make sense?
Yeah.
So they respond to you, and then they do something in response to you, and then of course their response makes you respond again. So it's a very dynamic situation. And then if you then couple that with the environment in which we exist, the situation that we're living in, then these three things together sort of form our likelihood to behave in a certain way. So it's situational, it's our own makeup, if you like, but it's also the way that we're responding to other people and how that's fed back to us. So it's a very sort of dynamic picture. He calls it reciprocal determination, which is kind of interesting. But perhaps the most important element here, which comes up again and again and again in the literature, is something called self-efficacy. And if there's one thing that I would say, if you're a parent and you want your children to have a good sort of get on in life, if you like, then self-efficacy is the one to help them do that. And self-efficacy is the belief that I can influence my environment and I can make things happen. My belief in my ability to succeed and to make things happen in different situations. So, I mean, you could call it self-belief, but it's more about the fact that I can affect a situation. So this is the level of self-efficacy I have. And in lots and lots of studies, study after study, happiness, success, material success, but also success in romantic relationships and all sorts of things like that seem to be linked to this quality of self-efficacy. And I think that's really, really important. So as a parent, it's one of the things that I always wanted my daughter to believe, that she could do things. And that doesn't mean that you believe, literally anything is possible. Of course, there are limits, and you always have to think about what's possible and realistic expectations to some degree. But the belief that you can affect what happens to you, I think, is really, really important. And that comes from Bandura's work, which I think is really interesting.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that makes sense. maybe not directly ties in, but I was watching a video when I was sort of doing a little YouTube uh, traversal through this trait space.
Yeah.
And I came across a lecture snippet,
Yeah.
which was, again, it was Jordan Peterson again, because he pops up quite a bit when Googling this kind of stuff. And it was how you can use your personality traits to basically succeed in whatever it is you're doing. And by that, he sort of used the example of basically, suppose you look at one of the traits like agreeableness or whatever, and then he said, okay, well, suppose now you enter a job that trait is, it benefits having that trait, then you'll probably succeed in that job. So basically, you're kind of talking about how you can, if you have some, I guess, self-knowledge of which one of these you kind of fit in, then you can kind of basically choose what path will probably work out best for you given your particular traits. And I guess it's not exactly the same thing as what you just said, but it seems like it could be a bit of a feedback loop.
Yeah.
Sort of effect.
Yeah. So I don't know much about Peterson's theoretical basis around this sort of topic. He's a bit of a Jungian, as we discovered in our first episode. So I would suspect, and there's an element there that I worry a bit about. So there's something there's a lot actually I don't agree with Peterson about. Just as an aside, one of our members of our Facebook group didn't send me a message. It was in a discussion, which, by the way, please do that. Let's have a chat, talk, because most of it is me at the minute and putting posts up there. Let's have a conversation. But he sort of made the point that Jordan Peterson has some pretty unpleasant views now, and he's kind of gone off into a bit of a tangent. I mean, he does he holds political views that I personally don't agree with. One of the things that I don't agree with him about, and I worry, and I think this informs his political views as well, is there's a sort of essentialism to him, and I worry whether that stems from some of this type stuff. So that people are like this. Mm-hmm. Therefore, if you are like this, then you should go for this job, or if you are like this, you should go for that job. And he some of his views around, I suppose, roles in families and what men and women do and don't do, sort of stray into the territory of, you're this type of person, you should be doing this. You're this type of person, you should be doing that. And again, that I think sort of starts to put people in boxes, which I'm not a big fan of. So yeah, that doesn't surprise me that he sort of talks about that, but I'm not sure I agree with that. In fact, I don't think I do. Yeah. Okay. There's one final one that I can't resist talking about, or one final one from my perspective. You might have other questions, but so here's something that I think is really interesting. So there was a guy called Essink, I think his name is, okay. But he was interested in the biological basis of personality, and I think that's really important, because if you think about what we've talked about so far, it's really just about describing what's actually happening. Mm-hmm. Rather than trying to explain it. Okay. And this is one of the big traps with personality trait research, is that you end up saying, oh, why do I do what I do? One of the questions you asked right at the beginning of this podcast was, why do people do what they do? People are sometimes do weird things. Why do they do that? And the answer to that might be, well, it's part of their personality traits. They tend to be more... I don't know, impulsive, let's say. They tend to be more impulsive. That's one of their personality traits. Mm-hmm. Well, that doesn't really explain it. It's just another way of describing what you've already said. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I've always found about these psychometric tests. I do psychometrics with people sometimes. I spent a lot of time doing them in my old job, and they'd fill out a form, they'd fill out a questionnaire, or on the computer normally, and at the end of it, it would give them a readout of their personality traits, and I'd then sort of do a bit of coaching with them around that. And it never ceased to amaze me how they were amazed. They'd look at it and they'd go, wow, that's amazing. That's exactly me. That's exactly right. And I'm thinking, well, not surprising because you answered the bloody questions.
Yeah, I mean...
But it's like a bit of it's almost like a trick. You know, it's kind of a sleight of hand. It's like actually what these psychometric tests are doing. They're just telling you what you've actually told the system, this sort of stuff. So Esync, what was he doing? Well, he's saying, let's look at causes. Why are people doing this? There's a caveat here, which is that there's not a lot of evidence for this,
okay.
which is a bit of a shame. Be great if there was. But anyway, this idea is great, and I do sort of think about it quite a lot. And he looked at extroversion versus introversion. So if you think about those two types, or those two extremes, extroversion versus introversion. And what he said is that if you think about, let's go first of all with the introvert. So introvert, what do I mean by introvert? Do you know what I mean?
Someone who kind of keeps to themselves, right?
Yeah.
And then extrovert would be the opposite, kind of outgoing and
that's it.
Likes to be,
So the introvert, if you think about what's going on in the brain, he highlighted a region of the brain called the ascending reticulocortical activating system.
Gotcha. Okay.
Otherwise known as ARAS. And it's really related to arousal, alertness. So it's a big factor when we're thinking about fight or flight or, you know, anything that gets our motor running, if you like. Now, his theory was that if you're an introvert, you have a chronic over-arousal of this area.
Okay, sure.
So this system, this ARAS, is chronically overactivated. So it's chronically over-aroused. Therefore, you don't want any more. You don't want any more arousal, thank you very much. Right, so if you go into a party with loud noise, music, lots of people talking, or if you're being asked to perhaps deal with more than one person at a time, lots of stuff going on, lots of information coming at you, that's just overstimulating. And you can't take it because you're already internally, your ARAS is overstimulated. It's over aroused anyway. So that's an introvert. An extrovert would be the opposite. They have chronic understimulation of this system. So you're always looking for stimulation. You're always looking to activate that system to get more of that, which I think is a really interesting idea. There's limited evidence for it, but it's not a dead duck, and I'd like to see more. Then the other one, neuroticism versus emotional stability. So neuroticism, you know, all the time looking for enemies and worried and anxious and that sort of thing. Whereas emotional stability, chill, not worried about anything, you know, just very, very cool, very calm. He linked that to the limbic system. So I think that's quite an interesting idea, is that we have these literal, physical, biological factors in us that create that. Now, I relate to that on a purely sort of instinctive level, because I know that there's a certain point at which, I don't know about you, so you tell me about yourself in a minute, but I feel like there's a certain point at which I just need to go away from people. So when I'm in the training room all day, for instance, if I'm delivering a course, I'm constantly stimulated. I'm constantly on. I'm having to deal with everybody, talk to people, be this person at the front there, sort of, in many ways performing, because that's what you do in a training room. And then at the end of the day, I don't want to talk to anybody. I get home and I just cannot face talking to my wife. You know, I just want to just peace and quiet. Just leave me alone. You know. So I think it feels like there's some truth in that. What about you?
Yeah, I mean that's very true. Thinking about, for example, this conference that's just at. Obviously, there's a lot of new people, and I have to present myself well, and also get across my point. But yeah, after a few hours of doing that, I'm like, I can't be asked with the mixer afterwards. I don't want to. I don't want to go for
Yes.
dinner with this group of people I've just met.
Oh,
I just want to
yeah.
go back to my hotel,
That's
put on the
right.
telly, and just relax. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. I think we're quite alike in that respect.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah. So that makes sense, but it doesn't necessarily have to be down to this ARAS, I suppose. It could be, you could describe that in lots of ways or use lots of causal reasons for that. But I think there is a physical element to this that these trait theories and the type theories don't necessarily address particularly well. But what we haven't done today is look at self, really. I don't think.
Yeah.
We've looked at personality traits to some degree. We've talked about behaviour, I think. But I think the self is something different. So I want to save that for another day. I'd like to get into what that is.
Yeah.
Because for me, that is something different. It's linked, obviously, just like it's linked to consciousness, but it's not the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think that would be an interesting topic for another day.
Yeah, no, definitely. I guess sort of one of my last questions here is, so these traits are often associated with self.
Yeah.
However, I guess my question is, with the traits, in principle, you could be an external observer and you could observe someone behaving in a particular way and then assign them, their points on the scale of whatever. And then I guess you could cross-correlate that with what they say about themselves. And then, in this hypothetical sanitized scenario, you could, in principle, generate the same result of the personality traits, both the person doing it themselves and just the external observer. So I suppose that removes the self there, because yourself, you've not done anything. Someone's watched you for long enough and then decided how they would describe you. And then I don't know if this is a thing that's done. I don't know how you would be an external observer without sort of messing with the system. But yeah, I suppose you don't. I guess that was my question. Yeah. So has there been any tests, or how able would it be to do a test like that, where you just watch somebody for a while and then you kind of decide what you think their personality is based on observation, and then see how correlated that is with their own response of the word.
Yeah, I mean, in a non-scientific way, that is done every day in businesses all around the world. And it's called a 360-degree appraisal.
Sure.
So what you do there is you get... So I do them. I've got my own system that I use. You give people questionnaires again about their traits, about how they... I generally do it in relation to leadership and management, because that's my main area of work. But so one of the questions, let's say the person... So there might be a person doing it that is the subject of this questionnaire. So let's call them Bob. Bob is doing a 360-degree questionnaire, and so Bob fills it out first. Some of the questions might be things like, again, you could do it as a Likert scale, which most people are familiar with. It's, I listen to my team. Let's say that is a statement. I listen to my team, and then when you fill the questionnaire out, you have to say whether you agree with that statement a lot, you agree with that statement slightly, you neither agree nor disagree, you disagree slightly, or you disagree a lot. So that's a Likert scale, or Likert scale, I don't know how you pronounce it. And obviously you can then translate that into numbers, which is essentially what you're doing, and that gives you a number. And there's lots of questions like that. So Bob answers those questions first, and then you send those same questions to Bob's boss, and Bob's team members, and maybe some peers of Bob's, maybe even his customers, people that are customers of his, and then they all fill out exactly the same form, which relates to his behaviour. And then you get a readout that comes back. Now that's not been validated in the same way that a personality a psychometric test is. That's looking at some very specific traits that or tendencies to behave in certain ways. But yeah, that's a way of doing that. And in my experience, again, this isn't scientific research, but in my experience, I find that most people, most of the time, are pretty aware of their strengths and weaknesses.
Okay.
It's rare for Bob to say, yeah, I would say I agree a lot that I am a good listener, and everybody else says is a terrible listener. That's very rare.
Yeah.
Very rare. It's now and again you see it. And that would normally be related to that person's own personality traits, which might be overly optimistic or even narcissistic. But generally speaking, most people are pretty aware of what their strengths and weaknesses are, if we want to use those terms. So that's a way of doing it. I don't know of any proper scientific research where these things have been correlated with actual behaviour, and that is one of the criticisms of a lot of these things. So, for instance, you might say, I'm going to use the psychometric test to see whether this person is going to be a good, I don't know, salesperson or software engineer or something. It's a very common way of recruiting, or one of the tools that you use to recruit. But a lot of these tests has very low predictability. So there's not much evidence that they accurately predict people's potential competence.
Sure. Yeah.
And if you're doing that as a recruitment tool, then that's pretty much the death knell of it, isn't it? Because that's what it's for. I don't use them for that these days. I use them as a way to start a conversation about people's tendencies to do certain things. And so, if people get it and they agree with it and they feel that they do that or do this, then it's a good way to talk about it. So that's how I use them. But I tend not to use them as a tool for recruitment, although I don't do much recruitment these days. Okay.
Well, yeah, no, that's good. Yeah. That's it's still got me curious about the self, because I suppose the thing is, with all these things, you could be good at playing the game, right? With the observer, with your boss, the 360 review. It could just be at work or in X setting, you understand how to behave to be a part of that little social group.
Yeah.
But I couldn't, in your mind, you might be hating it. You could be, okay, well, I have to be extroverted because I'm a salesperson. But in reality, I hate talking to people. So it could be, I suppose what yourself is still separate in my mind from what's being observed.
Yeah, I mean, that's that sort of brings up another question around like neurodiversity. So people who are not neurotypical, they are exhausted. So many people who are on the autistic spectrum, have high-powered jobs and do their jobs very well. I remember watching a video as part of my course about a woman who, she was a lecturer. She obviously stood in the classroom. She did all the stuff she had to do. But again, it was exhausting for her because she had to behave in a way that she knew was required in that setting, but it didn't come naturally to her. So yeah, I think there's a lot of that in a lot of us actually. We do tend to behave in certain ways. So yeah, the question is, how does that relate to self? So let's have that as a teaser. I believe I know actually what the self is. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think I know.
Cool.
But I'm not the only one who thinks that. Lots of people think they know, but I think I'm right.
Well, cool. Yeah, I mean, it'll be a good episode then next time.
Yeah. Let's do that one next time. Right, okay. So next time we'll do that maybe. And I think we should also do one that our friends on our Facebook group have suggested. So maybe check that out. We'll choose one of those for next time. And yeah, join in on the conversation. And also tell people about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Thanks, Thomas. And see you next time. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.